Namaskar. Dear viewers, today we'll be discussing the topic impacts of climate change. We know climate change impacts are irreversible in nature and it is affecting all the ecosystems, terrestrial, marine ecosystems, and also all the living organisms as well. So in today's session, we'll be discussing in detail about the impacts of climate change from various perspectives, from the perspective of ecosystem, from the perspective of human beings, human welfare, well-being, and also how organisms will be adapting towards the changing climatic condition. And also we'll be discussing about the urban systems like cities, settlements, infrastructure, and also economic sectors. So one by one we'll be discussing each and every subdivisions or in fact dimensions of human systems. So the agenda in front of us is that we need to look at deeply that how climate change impact is, year after year it is increasing and it is affecting all the ecosystems. As I said earlier, it is affecting the terrestrial and also marine ecosystem also. The second important aspect is that how this ecosystem change or ecosystem, resilience is impacted by climate change. So when I say ecosystem is changing because of increasing surface temperature or the changing climatic factors, if this kind of change can have a drastic effect on the food systems as far as agriculture system is concerned, it can affect the fisheries population, the livelihood will be affected, and also the related aspect as far as ecosystem effect or change is concerned is the biodiversity change. So both simultaneously we need to take into account so that there are a lot of intricacies, a lot of interrelationship is there between ecosystem resilience and biodiversity. The second aspect we'll be discussing is on the food systems. Food systems means how climate is going to affect the food availability and food production and also the vulnerability aspects. And the third one is we'll be discussing about the water availability and water insecurity also. The next comes the most important aspect, that is human health and well-being. And related aspect as far as human system we discuss is about the migration and displacement. And if you see a certain section of people are more vulnerable to climate change, why not the other group? So the concept of human vulnerability is more important for us to understand the impacts of climate change, because that will help us to tailor-made certain adaptation strategies or climate policies also. And the last one we'll be discussing about the economic sectors. So to start with, we need to talk about the ecosystem. And as I said earlier, that when you talk about ecosystem, there are a lot of interaction is there between the biotic and abiotic factors. And this increase in surface temperature can have an impact on the interrelationship between the biotic and abiotic factors, because it is going to affect the biogeochemical cycling of nutrients. Even the energy flow also will be influenced by the changing climatic conditions. So when you see the ecosystem as a whole, the ecosystem, the structure and the function of ecosystem is going to be affected by by climate change. So a lot of examples are there. If you see, for example, let us take the coral reef as an ecosystem. Coral reef as such, if you see, it is very rich in productivity. It is known for the habitats, diverse habitats, the organisms, whether it's a coral or other fish. Many organisms are dependent on the resources that is there in the coral reef ecosystems. These coral reef ecosystems are severely affected by the changing climatic condition, particularly the sea surface temperature. Because of the increase in the sea surface temperature, the coral the symbiotic relationship will be affected. The second point is that there are a lot of organisms are thriving in the coral reef ecosystem. So these organisms will be affected, and definitely there is a possibility of local extinction. Local extinction means certain endemic species will be extinct because of the changing climatic condition. So if the coral reef ecosystem is going to be affected, think about the forward linkages it is having, the fish population and other, if you look at the food web, completely the chain of events. This chain of events, when you look at it, definitely the climate change is having a far-reaching consequences. So second important point as far as ecosystem as such is concerned is the resilience. How to make an ecosystem resilient. So for this, definitely, what we need to take into account is the positive aspect of ecosystem. That is basically, if you see every ecosystem is providing a lot of services, ecosystem services. The critical ecosystem services will be affected because of the climate change impacts. So when you talk about the resilience, when the ecosystem is diverse, and when it is rich in the population, definitely the ecosystem will be very, very resilient. So we need to take all the steps possible to make the ecosystem resilient. How it is possible? Definitely we wanted to enrich the ecosystem with positive aspects, particularly giving enough space for the habitat or even the living organisms to survive, even under extreme conditions. So that is the basic aspect of ecosystem resilience. For example, if you see an agriculture system, agro-ecosystem, how to make the agro-ecosystem resilient. So for that one, what we need to do is that whatever the crops we are growing, whatever the activities, crop production activities we are undertaking in a farm or a field, so that should be climate resilient. That means that we need to take into account, for example, the kind of crops we'll be looking for climate resilient crops like coarse cereals, sorghum, ragi, because that requires less of water. So when you incorporate that particular climate resilient crop in the crop calendar or crop rotation or cropping pattern, it is definitely that will help us to make the agroecosystem resilient. The second aspect as far as water availability is concerned, so if you wanted to address the issue of water scarcity, definitely we need to look for certain crop which requires less of water. So by incorporating such aspects, such practices, definitely we can make the ecosystem, agroecosystem resilient. Okay. The second aspect is the biodiversity. When you talk about biodiversity, we know that how important it is because a lot of services it is providing to us. This biodiversity, because each and every organism is having its own optimum temperature or cardinal temperature. If there is a change in the temperature or any other environmental factor, that can have an effect on their survival and their habitat, whatever the kind of resources that they're consuming, whether it's a food and other resources, so that will be constrained. So because of the increase in surface temperature, the biodiversity, the ecosystem, that particular, it gets imbalanced. So in that way, what happened? Many of the organisms will be threatened. Okay, further, many examples are there. Because, and for instance, let us take an example of a plant. So if the cardinal temperature is affected because of the increase in surface temperature, what will happen to the plant? The plant will try to adapt for some time. But later on, if the temperature is increasing still further, it may not be in a position to survive. So it definitely, it will be extinct. As far as the animal is concerned, the animals, because of the increase in surface temperature, there is a possibility of geographical spread. When I say spread, it may move towards higher latitude or higher altitude because the temperature may be favorable or environmental factors may be favorable. So the most prominent symptom of climate change impact is there is a geographical spread. Means most of the organisms which are mobile, they are moving towards higher latitudes and higher altitudes. So that is the most visible thing that we are observing in the recent past. The second important aspect, if they are not in a position to move or mobile, so what will happen? They will be extinct because of many factors, particularly the temperature, and also those organisms may be affected by the pest and disease-causing organisms also. So that way, also the organisms are threatened. Third important thing is that availability of resources, whether it's a food resources or water, any resources for the living organisms. If it is constrained, definitely there will be a lot of challenges for the organisms to survive. Next aspect, as far as the biodiversity is concerned, because both ecosystem resilience and biodiversity is very, very interlinked, and definitely we need to take into account together. Integrated approach is required for managing the biodiversity. The third aspect, as far as today's discussion, is the food system, food security also. When you talk about food system, the agriculture system, because it's a very climate sensitive enterprise. This climate sensitive enterprise, because of the increase in temperature and the requirement for water and other resources, what happened, this agriculture system is going to be impacted severely by climate change. So this way, what will happen, the net result will be the crop yield, the crop production, that will be drastically reduced. And because of this reason, definitely if the food production is affected, the crop yield will be drastically reduced, and that can have a drastic effect on the human well-being also, even there are a lot of other things, because we all dependent totally on the food grains. Even the industrial sector, agriculture-based industries are also there. So those industries also will be affected if the food system is vulnerable to climate change. So that issue of food insecurity is more prominent nowadays, particularly in the African country, because any extreme event, that can have a drastic effect on the agriculture system, and definitely, if you see the people who will be more affected, or who are more vulnerable, or because of the socioeconomic condition, and also even the physical conditions also. So this makes the people more vulnerable, and that way the impact of climate change will be more prominent. And as far as the food insecurity is concerned, as I told earlier, so not only this food security, food insecurity has to be taken in isolation, it has to be combined with human displacement also, because of the extreme events like drought, flood, there is a possibility of internal displacement. People who are working in a climate sensitive enterprise, they will be compelled to move to other greener pastures. So it's involuntary in nature, and that also can have a drastic effect on the environment, like cities or other regions where the population will be moving for getting their livelihood, to meet their livelihood needs also. So in that way, it is very, very important thing, because food insecurity, human displacement and migration also has to be taken together. Next aspect is the water systems. When I talk about water systems, it's a very interesting aspect, because of increase in surface air temperature, it can have an effect on the cryosphere. And think about certain river system, perennial river system, which is dependent on the cryospheric melt, glacier melt, like our perennial Himalayan rivers. Because of the climate change, the water flow, then that will be influenced, and if it is increasing further, what will happen? Definitely there is what you call the glacier melt that can have a drastic effect on the river flow, and definitely the organisms in the river systems also will be affected. So impact of climate change on water systems has to be taken into account from the cryospheric melt. The second aspect is that if you see the cryospheric melt or glacier melt also can have an impact on the increase in sea level. So this increase in sea level, particularly in the coastal regions, what happened, whether even if it is an agricultural activity, what will happen, because of the increase in the sea level, the land in the coastal region may become saline. So that also can have an effect on the water insecurity. Another aspect, as far as water system is concerned, because of the increase in surface air temperature, there is more chance for waterborne diseases also, because that also will be increasing because of the increase in surface air temperature, and that waterborne diseases and another related aspect is vector-borne diseases also. So both these waterborne and vector-borne diseases will increase because of the issues related with the water system. Another aspect is that, when you talk about the water and food, what comes to our mind is, again, food safety. Because when you talk about food safety, because of the increase in surface temperature and humidity, what happened, there is a possibility of occurrence, more incidence of toxigenic fungi on most of the crops. So that may lead to what? Food safety issues also. So this is about the water systems and water security. Next one is the human well-being or human health. So when you talk about human health, as I rightly said about the waterborne diseases and vector-borne diseases, it's going to be more prominent because of the climate change impact. Further, if you see the vulnerability of human beings to climate change. So that is a concept, it's a multidimensional concept. It's a dynamical concept because the human vulnerability, it has been designed or shaped by certain cultural practices or cultural processes also. And also, if a community or what you call a human community, if they are known for inequity, they will be less resilient to climate change. So there is a point of gender equality, and also kind of equity is very, very essential for achieving the climate resilience. So this also has to be taken into account, because when you talk about human well-being, human vulnerability also has to be taken into account. So definitely human vulnerability as a concept, it has been driven by even socioeconomic conditions also. Nevertheless, the aspect of human vulnerability can be addressed by focusing more on indigenous knowledge, giving rights to the indigenous people, and their knowledge, if it has been adopted or if it has been brought to the mainstream, that can help us to increase the adaptation capacity also. So that way the human health, well-being and human vulnerability is linked. So going further, so we need to talk about the cities, the settlements and infrastructure. So when you talk about cities, the settlements, very important aspect is that in the recent past, if you see the population in the urban areas, it is increasing. Definitely for many reasons. One of the important reason is the economic reason, because there are a lot of greener pastures in the cities, and people tend to migrate towards the cities to get their livelihood and also meet certain other educational needs and socio-economic reasons as well. So in this way, what happened, the cities are bulging. When I say cities are bulging, because of the increase in the population. So even at the global level also, if you see in the last 5 years, particularly the 2015 to 2020, around 400 million people, it has increased. The urban population is increased by 400 million. It's a huge amount. So because of the more pressure on the city environment itself, it will be constrained for the resources. So as the population is increasing and more, definitely there's a lot of pressure on the resources in the city environment. And also, if you see the cities, globally also, it is more present in the coastal areas. Okay, and the coastal community and the cities are more vulnerable to changing climatic condition, whether it is an increase in the sea level rise or increase in the temperature, air temperature. So these cities are more vulnerable, and for one reason is there is scarcity for resources, scarcity for water and other facilities also. So in this case, what happened, what we need to take into account is that how best we can use the city as such, because as far as the resource use is concerned, how to make the settlements more active. When I say settlements more active, it should be having, what is it called, providing enough green spaces in the city environment. So that will help us to mitigate the negative impacts of climate change. So if you see, along with the cities, the settlements, if the settlement is unplanned, if it's not formal. So that also make the population more vulnerable to climate change. So growing population on one hand, and also the informal or settlements also creating a lot of problem in the city environment because of climate change. Another aspect, as far as the related aspect, is the infrastructure. When you talk about infrastructure, it's a very interesting aspect, because infrastructure provides a lot of critical resources, critical resources, services to the people, individuals, society, the community. So this infrastructure can be severely affected because of climate change. Okay, and particularly the what you call that extreme events, the drought, flood, that can have a drastic effect on the infrastructure. So this negative impact on infrastructure may have an effect on the energy, transportation, energy disruption. So in the networks I'm talking about it. So energy and transportation network can be affected because of climate change. So this infrastructure, that is also very, very important aspect that we need to take into account. So now, going further, the most important aspect that comes to our mind is the economic aspect. So when you talk about economic, it's a very interesting thing, because economic sector as such, if you see, it is very vulnerable to climate change. On one hand, the climate change impact is increasing, the damage and the losses and damage also is increasing on all the systems, natural systems. But this economic sector, how it is going to be impacted, because the economic, the network, the structure of it is going to be affected because of climate change. So what is that? The magnitude of damage may vary with the sector, definitely. There are a lot of sectors are there. It will definitely vary with the sectors and also region. Certain regions may be more vulnerable and certain may not be. But as far as the climate change impact is concerned, particularly the economic impact, economic losses, all the regions is going to be affected, irrespective of their the adaptive capacity. Whether it's industrial countries or less developed countries, every country is going to be affected because of climate change. Because even in industrial setup, for example, industrial countries like United States of America, they may also be impacted by the extreme events like tropical cyclones, storms, hurricane. So if that is going to impact their environment, whether it is a Texas or Florida, think about the resources, energy resources, so that they are going to be affected. So in that way, what happened, every region is going to be impacted by climate change. And definitely, as far as sectors is concerned, few sectors will be more sensitive, particularly the climate sensitive sectors like agriculture, forestry, even the fisheries, tourism. So these sectors will be more affected because of climate change. And when you talk about the losses and damage, economic losses, there are many reasons, many dimensions to economic losses. The first and foremost dimension, as far as economic loss is concerned, it is the infrastructure disruption and supply chain disruption and damaged property. So the economic loss is due to this aspect, that is infrastructure disruption, infrastructure damage. The second important aspect, economic losses, the climate change impact on the inputs. When I talk about inputs, for instance, agriculture, for example, agriculture crop yield. So if there is a decrease in the agriculture crop yield because of climate change, that can have an impact not only on the population, agriculture yield or agriculture sustainability, it can also have an effect on the agro-based industries. So there's definitely a forward linkages. Okay. The second aspect, as far as the losses, economic losses is concerned, the availability of water. So when you talk about availability of water, that is also again an input. So when there is a scarcity of water, so certain industries are dependent on water resources. Most of the industries like iron and steel, most of the industries are dependent on water availability. So that sector is going to be affected because of climate change. So particularly not only industries, agriculture is also main user of water resources. So that is the second aspect, water availability. The third aspect is the labor productivity. When I talk about labor productivity, labor who are associated with climate sensitive enterprises like agriculture, the forestry activity, they will be more affected because of climate change, because the kind of impact they're going to get from the heat, high temperature heat stroke, that is going to drastically reduce the labor productivity. So this is the second loss because of climate change. The third important thing is that the costs associated with the adaptation finance and even the rebuilding or recovery of infrastructure, and also the disaster spending, because a lot of money is involved in restructuring the recouping the system also. If something happens to the system, whether it's a human system or an economic system, definitely we need to take the steps to recoup it. So in that way, a lot of money is involved in this thing as far as the adaptation finance is concerned. So next one is, as far as the region is concerned, the most significant thing I wanted to stress here is the growth aspect, economic growth. So as I told earlier, all the regions is going to be affected, whether it's the industrial countries or less developed countries, or even the SIDS, small and developing countries, all are going to be affected. That can be seen by the growth, whether it's a gross domestic growth or economic growth, that can be very well seen. And this has been observed in the recent past also. Next one is the livelihood. So when you talk about livelihood, as I told earlier, definitely the people who are involved or associated with climate sensitive sectors, their livelihood is going to be affected. That's the first point. The second important point is that certain communities may be more vulnerable because of the socioeconomic vulnerabilities. They have their own vulnerability aspect, because for example, the children, the elderly population, they may be more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because of the economic condition, physical condition. So that is one aspect. The second is that the adaptive capacity. Maybe that particular community may not have the enough facilities, finance or resources to get themselves adapted. So adaptive capacity is also a very important thing. So socioeconomic vulnerability and adaptive capacity also will influence the society, that how well they can address the issue of climate change. Next one is the most important aspect I just wanted to mention is that we have discussed so much about the impacts of climate change, but as far as the economic sector is concerned, the potential risk associated with the climate change or even the current level damage, so that has not been brought into the planning process. That has not been brought into the planning strategies, or even the budgeting practices also, even adaptation practices, because a lot of money is to be incorporated in the exercise. Then only the economic sector can be resilient against climate change. So to sum it up, today we have discussed the various aspects of impacts of climate change on the food system or water availability, and also we have discussed about how human beings will be affected because of their vulnerabilities, whether it is a migration or a displacement. Lastly, we have discussed about the cities, the settlements, how they are influenced by the climate change. And the last one is that the climate change is not going to leave even the economic sector also. So thank you very much.